So, welcome everybody. Uh, it's a real pleasure to be joined on Skype with David Loy. Uh, David is a prolific author of many, many books. He's a Buddhist scholar. He is a authorized Zen teacher in the Sanbo Kyodan tradition of Japanese Zen Buddhism. He is also one of the founding members of the Rocky Mountain EcoDharma Retreat Center in Boulder, Colorado. Now, his main research interest is the dialogue between Buddhism and modernity, which is something that we're going to speak about today, and the social implications of Buddhist teachings. He holds a Ph.D. in philosophy from the National University of Singapore, and also was the senior tutor in the philosophy department of Singapore, the National University of Singapore from 1978 to 1984. David, welcome.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for the invitation.
So David, just to sort of situate our conversation here today, in some ways it's a follow-on from the interviews that I had with Locke Kelly and John Prendergast.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the theme had been awakening, which is sort of linked to the concept of anatta in Buddhism, of no self. And I think it's obviously very important to talk about anatta here as not just as a mental concept, but as an experience. And that's ultimately, of course, where the rubber meets the road. That these are just theories until they're really experienced, and then they really take fruit in that sense. And not to go into a long story about awakening, but in my own experience, I had a sort of a conflict between sort of the absolutist awakening teachings, which is that sort of saying that the world is not real, and more of an embodied awakening teaching, which is the themes that I also encountered in your book with the words immanent, and transcendent. So going even deeper into that, the ecological and systemic consequences of these awakening experiences are certainly profound, right? Because in a sense, when you have these experiences of oneness, then you start thinking about sustainability. You start thinking about, what's happening in the world today. Why do we have so much conflict? Why do we seem to be destroying our natural environment, which is obviously part of us, which is us. So in a sense, that's what attracted me to want to have a dialogue, a conversation with you, because your work is certainly right in the middle of all of this. So maybe I've said a lot there. Maybe to sort of get your perspective on this, could you just tell us a little bit about anatta? What is anatta? What is no self?
Well, you've raised not just one question, but a whole web of issues, right? And I think it's really important to see try to talk at least about the relationship among them. So in order to talk about anatta, usually translated as non-self, not self, no self, I guess I would want to back up and relate it to what I think is probably the most important concept in Buddhism, certainly early Buddhism, which is dukkha, right? The term usually translated into English as suffering, but that only works if we understand it in the broadest possible sense, not just physical and mental pain, but discomfort, dissatisfaction, anxiety, dis-ease. And that's really what the Buddha said. That's what he had to teach, was dukkha and how to end it. And there are many different types of dukkha, of course, but in some ways, I think the most important, or maybe the one that cuts the deepest, is connected with the sense of self. So the other side of the no self teaching is that we normally have this delusion that there's a me that's separate from the world, that there's some self somehow inside, maybe behind the eyes or inside the ears or something, and I'm inside and the rest of the world is outside. And the point of the Anatta claim is not only that that's a delusion, but that there's a really problematic suffering that's connected with it. And the way that I would try to explain that, I think, is that as long as we have a sense of separation, which is a delusion, this supposedly separate self doesn't really exist, doesn't have any reality of its own, and therefore it's inherently uncomfortable, insecure. It can never secure itself because there's nothing there that could be secured. And so a lot of the dukkha is the way we experience this fundamental insecurity at the core of our beings, and as a sense of lack, as this feeling that I think we all have. It's one of the great secrets of life, that we all have this sense that something is wrong with me, something is missing, I'm not good enough. And so we become preoccupied with trying to secure ourselves, trying to make ourselves feel more real in the world. And I think that explains a lot about not only the kind of individual obsessions like money and fame and so forth that we become preoccupied with, but also collectively. We have an economy that requires us to be caught up in consumerism, that wants to think of us as consumers who will find happiness by consuming things. And so we can see it's not, this sense of lack is not only an individual problem, but a collective one. And now, so what I'm getting at now is, I think that's the problem. And the point of Anatta is that Buddhist and related teachings basically offer us a path to help us let go of this delusion of a separate self, which is very much connected with meditation. You can say the delusion of self is composed of mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and reacting and so forth. And the process of meditation is really kind of letting go of theirs, so that we can sort of let go of ourselves and then realize our non-duality with the rest of the world, right? So rather than David Loy or Ken being some separate reality looking out through your eyes at the world, what we can come to realize is that we are manifestations of the world, that we are one of the way, each of us is one of the ways, well, like everything else is, one of the ways in which this world is manifesting. What's really important is that realization, and I don't want to say it's all or nothing. It's like, awakening isn't usually that way. There's various degrees, various stages, various steps along the way where we have a little glimpse and so forth. But the important point is that this can put an end to this fundamental dukkha, the delusion of separate self. And maybe I've said enough for the moment that you want to follow up with another question of your own. Does that help? Is that speaking to your concern? If not, maybe you can refocus your question there.
No, thank you. Now, obviously, this anatta is a as you said, a bold. It's a bold claim. It's almost like in some ways, I guess for many people who are listening in, it's kind of like a stake in the ground. Like this is obviously flies in the face of one's experience. It's like I need this job. If I don't get this job, someone else is going to get this job. If I don't, there's always self interest in other interests, right?
Sure.
And the other point I wanted to raise is obviously Descartes' I think therefore I am, which is underpinning the the philosophical base of Western thinking, that
Hmm.
identity is coalesced into thinking, into thought, and so there's the assumption of mind and, well, I don't, this is mind and self
Right,
have
right,
coalesced into something,
right,
concrete there. So
right.
ego is almost like taken to be the norm, and anatta is just saying, okay, all of that is just bunk. That we are all, in a sense, in the soup. We are a soup.
Yeah, right.
But at the
Yeah.
same time, I can't deny that I have needs. I need to drink water,
Sure,
and
sure.
if like there's only a certain amount of water, and if I drink this, you don't get this. So
Yeah, that's not what the Anatta claim is denying, of course, right? I mean, to start with, Descartes' argument really assumes what he's trying to prove, right? He says, "I think." Well, what's this I? I mean, that's the great question, isn't it? I mean, to be more accurate, he should say something like thinking. It's not I think, but there is thinking. The whole question of who or what it is that's doing the thinking, well, that's what needs to be clarified. And he kind of just assumes somehow that he's got the answer to that. Um, I mean, the anatta no self claim is a tricky one. Of course, you're right. It's subtle and it's very often misunderstood. Um, Another way to say it, I mean, obviously, there's a sense in which you are different from me, right? Um, so it's not pointing at a bowl of porridge where every bite is indistinguishable from every others. Maybe a better way to say it or explicate it is that the sense of self that we have is a construct. The construct is real in its effects, as it were. That is to say, um, it's a psychological, social, linguistic construct that functions in certain kinds of ways and needs to function in certain kinds of ways. The idea isn't to completely get rid of the sense of self. I mean, we couldn't function if that happened, but it's more about um, seeing through the delusion of a separate self, and that gives us a kind of different angle on our lives and our experience, and it gives us like two sides to it. It's like there's our normal way of understanding experience, in which the world is a collection of separate things, including you and I, and we're born at a certain time and do things and change and eventually die. Yeah, that dimension is there, and it's not denied. But the claim of Anatta is that there's this other, what my Zen master would call the essential dimension, the true self. Or another way to talk about the self is to say that, in a way, I'm hollow, right? That what the path really helps us realize is that what what we are aware of is, as it were, a kind of a vessel or a container for ways of thinking, feeling, acting, and so forth that sort of spring up from something deeper than our usual consciousness. And this is very much connected with things like creativity, because the most creative people know that it's not something that they do in any ego sense, but it's more that they open up and they have access to deeper layers. There's a metaphor here that I like and I've used a lot. When we have the delusion of a separate self and the dukkha that goes along with that, the anxiety, uh, the sense that we're not real enough, and so forth, this sense of lack, it's as if at the very core of our being there's a kind of a black hole, a cosmological black hole that it's like it sits there and it's almost as if it's trying to suck us in and we're trying to sort of fill it up, but it's a bottomless hole. The point of awakening is that there's a kind of transformation. Buddhism talks about transformation at the base, where what was experienced as a sense of lack, there's a kind of a paravriti, and rather that core becomes a kind of fountain a fountain of creativity, a fountain of spontaneity. It's our link with something deeper or greater than ourselves, or at least our usual way of understanding ourselves. So, these are, I don't know how helpful people will find those kind of metaphors, but we do need to be careful when we talk about anatta, and don't think of it as sort of denying certain types of experience. It's more a different way of understanding our experience rather than a denial of something that seems so otherwise seems so obvious to us. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I am trying to explain it in my own words here. I agree that anatta is indeed a very subtle, can be very powerful. It's almost like the changes that happen on a psycho-spiritual level are so so it's almost as if I think I gave this analogy in one of my previous interviews. For me, it's a lot to do with a fixed frame of reference, like a rigid way of looking at the world, and everything is changing. This is impermanence. It's one of the biggest Buddhist teachings, anicca, right? So, in a sense, I think of it in that way too. That the self, the ego, is a kind of a fixed way of approaching the world. It's a stance in which you approach the world and say, I must have this and I want this, and like that is in many ways artificial because everything is moving, and what you have at that moment sometimes can run up against what the world presents itself to you as, and that is for me suffering, because you suffer if you don't get certain things, or if you continually grasp for something that you can't get. You don't accept the way things are, as Byron Katie would say, and all the sages would say. If you don't accept reality as it is, then you suffer. It's the gap between your expectations and what life presents to you, what life actually presents to you as. Now, I guess that leads me to the important point, which is, how do we realize this? How do we awaken?
Well, if I follow up on what I just said about anatta, another aspect of it, which I really didn't say enough about, is the idea that what my Zen master would call our essential nature. It's the realization, letting go of ourselves is the realization that there's something beyond these habitual ways of thinking and feeling and desiring, which we are normally caught up in, which, we identify with, we think this is what we are. So letting go of all of that opens up this other dimension, the realization that there's an important sense in which it has no form, it has no color, it has no concept. My true nature is in a way a nothing, or better, a no thing, that because it is in and of itself a no thing, it can become anything. So there's incredible flexibility and going back to the kind of impermanence and insubstantiality that Buddhism emphasizes. This is really a statement both about the nature of the world, but our own true nature when we really kind of open up to that. And so it helps free us from the places where we normally tend to be stuck, right? I mean, insofar as we have this sense of lack I was talking about, we're trying to, at a very deep level, we're trying to secure ourselves by identifying with something, by grasping with something. And for intellectuals, such as you and I, part of that is we want to identify with certain ideas, maybe a certain tradition, maybe Buddhism, So it can make us rigid. It can make us defensive. whereas the real point is the realization of a kind of flowing ability to transform according to the situation. For example, there's a very famous Zen koan which goes something like this. The student asked the master, what's the constant activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? In other words, what is special about these supposedly enlightened people? How do they actually live in the day-to-day? What magical powers are they expressing? And the answer of the Zen teacher is very simple: responding appropriately. But knowing how to respond appropriately means we're not stuck in these expectations of what needs to be the case, that we can actually respond appropriately to the situation, and that's something that has to be cultivated. You asked how we realize this. Well, I think this really helps us understand the importance of meditation, because meditation, more than anything else, is the process of learning to let go of those habitual patterns of thinking, feeling, expectation, plans, memories, and so forth. It's the way these habitual processes kind of work together, congeal, that they create the sense of a self inside, separate from the world outside. And so meditation is what's helping us let go of them. The other thing to add to that, if we understand that process as a kind of deconstruction of the sense of self, or better, a deconstruction of the sense of separation between inside and outside, there's also reconstruction that happens, which I think is the key to understanding what karma is really about. The Buddha emphasized intention, motivation, and the importance of karma is transforming our motivations. If I'm motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion, I'm actually going to experience the world in a very different way than someone who's motivated by the opposites: generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. So I think the deeper karma teaching isn't about cosmological something coming back to bite us, but how when we transform our motivations, then we will come to experience the world in a different and by no accident more non-dual way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow, yeah. Obviously, a lot of resonant themes there well, I think of karma as conditioning, right?
Yeah.
It's a habit. It's condition. It's patterns. It's kind of this behavioral inertia that moves us forward in life. And as you point out, meditation allows us to experience the world fresh every moment, and out of that freshness, out of that more embodied identification, but imbibement, I don't know what you call it. You're just sitting in the no thing. When you're sitting in the no thing, sometimes very very spontaneous things can happen, and that just arises free from the conditioned, limited modes of expression, and as you say, appropriate response is skillful means, isn't it? It's wisdom. It's being able to approach something with a kind of skill, right?
Yeah. And that includes openness. I mean, openness, so that we're actually perceiving, experiencing what's happening, and not prejudging, or it's not being filtered by lots of our expectations about what needs to be the case, what should be the case. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I tend to distinguish between what I call deconstruction, which is what's actually happening when we're meditating, and reconstruction, which is, when we get up off the cushion, and how are we actually relating to people? What's motivating us? We all have some elements of the three poisons, but on this path, we transform the motivations by what we actually do. It's like that conditioning you talked about. There's it doesn't just happen. It happens when we intentionally make the decision to act in a certain kind of compassionate way. And if we keep doing that, then that becomes part of our nature, as it were, or part of our way of relating to the world. And those positive motivations are very important in Buddhism, as far as how we actually live day to day, relating to each other, relating to other people.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love the analogy of I don't know who said it now, but watering seeds, right?
Hmm.
It depends on what attention is. Attention is like the more attention you place on your good attributes,
Hmm.
the more those things flower and grow in
Right.
your consciousness, and takes a certain kind of discipline.
That's
It
right.
takes a certain
Which
kind of
seeds do we
attitude.
water? Yeah. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, David, EcoDharma,
Hmm.
and just sort of, I guess, situating ourselves in on planet Earth
Hmm.
in the year 2017, uh, we seem to be facing a bit of a crisis here. I don't
I
know
think so.
when I don't know when the world was not in crisis, but we seem to be at some kind of a tipping point here. We have a capitalist machine run by corporations that are profit driven, that don't seem to have an emphasis on sustainability, and also we seem to have a crisis of of separation,
Yeah.
conflict
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
cultures and
Yeah.
people, and you know, I guess, how do we relate all that we've said about anatta, dukkha,
Mm.
uh, dharma into acting in a way that helps others?
Mm. Well,
It's just
yeah.
such a huge question, obviously, but
Yeah.
I think for most people listening to this, there's bound to be some kind of a resonance there, which is how does it translate? You know,
Right. Yeah. Um, well, I mean that's definitely one of the really important questions facing us today. In fact, I would say that if Buddhism couldn't help us understand or respond to the kind of crises we have today, especially the ecological, right? If Buddhists couldn't or didn't want to respond to that, then I would say Buddhism isn't what we need, right? But in fact, I think that Buddhism, in some ways, is exactly what we need, or one of the really important things we need. Um, we were talking a bit ago about Buddhism emphasizing impermanence and insubstantiality. And it's interesting that that applies to Buddhism itself, right? The way that Buddhism has evolved and developed and transformed as it spread, interacted with local cultures. So, for example, my my own Buddhist training has been Zen practice in Japan, but Zen or Chan in Japan, the Buddha didn't teach Chan. That's the form that Buddhism took. One of the main forms Buddhism took when Mahayana went to China and interacted with the native traditions, especially Taoism, right? So that's an example. I mean, I think Buddhism is great at this sort of flexibility. And I think what's interesting now is that Buddhism faces its greatest challenge ever now that it comes to the modern world. You know, the modern world not only being so different in terms of its secularity, uh, but also quite extraordinary in terms of the kind of crises that we face today. I mean, we just don't have a climate crisis. We've got a much larger ecological crisis in terms of extinction event and many other things we could talk about. I'm actually writing a book on the topic right now. Um, and then we can look at economic situations. A lot of economists think that the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, I mean, that's just the truth is we never resolved the problems that led to that, and we're likely to have another one, as you, I think, know better than I. Um, Political issues. I mean, we can go on and on. But what I think all this points to, really, I mean, as you say, in a way, the world is always in crisis, but we are now in a super crisis, a mega crisis. I think that there's a kind of irony. We've created a global civilization that really seems to be self-destructing. It's lost its way. It doesn't know what else to do. It's like our greatest value, our greatest obsession is sort of never-ending economic growth and consumption, and that's all we know how to do. We don't know what else to value, what other meaning to give, and so this is a very special time in human history, what Joanna Macy calls the Great Turning. You know, when either there's going to be some very deep transformation, or civilization, I think, as we know it, is really going to break down. And there are even, biologists and such who wonder whether our species will survive the kind of changes that climate change is likely to bring. So, in this really critical situation, we need all the help we can get. And I think one of the really important things about Buddhism is that it has something very special to offer. Traditionally in Asia, Buddhism emphasized individual dukkha, right? Individual suffering due to my own individual karma and my own individual craving and my own individual delusions. In Asia, Buddhism really, in a way, had to do that. None of the societies that Buddhism developed or spread to, none of them was democratic. You couldn't challenge the social order. You couldn't challenge the king, right? You get squashed. To a fair extent, especially in the early days, Buddhism was kind of dependent on royal support. So Buddhism doesn't challenge that. In fact, the karma teaching was kind of used often to sort of rationalize that. But now that Buddhism comes to the modern world, we're much more aware of what you might call social dukkha, institutionalized dukkha. I've written quite a bit about the idea of we've institutionalized these three poisons that we alluded to a moment ago. I think our economic system is more or less institutionalized greed. If we understand greed as you never have enough, right? Our economic system has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse. Consumers never consume enough, corporations never profitable enough, GNP never big enough, and so forth. I think we've institutionalized ill will in our militarism. And I think we've institutionalized delusion in terms of the media, not only in terms of false news that's been so important in the last year or so, but also the way that the media are, for the most part, large corporations who make their money from advertising. So they are part of the larger system that encourages us to think of ourselves as consumers, right? So looking at it from that point, and that I think is kind of a straight Buddhist analysis of our situation in terms of sort of webs of delusion that we're caught up in. And I think here, Buddhism has a lot to offer in terms of offering a rather unique perspective on this that I think we need. And the other thing I would add, of course, is that we also have this wonderful model in Buddhism, the whole idea of the bodhisattva, right? That as we begin to awaken, we realize that my own well-being is not separate from the well-being of other people or separate from the well-being of the earth. And so a very important part of awakening is that as we sort of see through the delusion of self, we also transform our usual habitual self-centered ways of living into more non-dual, more compassionate. We become more concerned about living in ways that help the well-being of everyone and everything. And I think that's exactly the kind of model that we really need today. In fact, I wonder if the kinds of action or activism that we need today can really work without something like a bodhisattva model. Because what's really distinctive about it is that the bodhisattva combines personal, individual practice, meditation and so forth, to find their own emptiness, their own essential nature, like we were talking about, but also realizes that hey, that's not sufficient. We also need to bring that equanimity, to bring that realization in terms of how we actually engage. Mm-hmm. And again, engaging not only on the individual service level, helping homeless people or something like that, but also working for ways to address the kind of institutionalized problems we have today. So, I mean, I think I'm just touching on some of the issues there. We could say a lot more, for example, about how the Bodhisattva path works. But, I mean, I think at this point in history, Buddhism needs to develop in this direction. And if it does, it has a great deal to offer that can help us respond to the kind of situation we're in.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you. In many points that you touched there, Buddhism, the beauty of Buddhism, in many ways, it's very rational. The Buddha has always taught that you should always test it. I think the story of the gold tooth, right? You have to test it out and see if it works for yourself. And the way in which it has evolved, especially here, I'm very sort of interested to see a lot of the events that are happening here, especially in Northern California with non-duality and psychotherapy, non-duality and science, and just the confluence of non-duality and say quantum physics. It's just amazing. It's really important in my view, and sort of if we are to get together in groups and sort of have a common, well, see, this is the thing I think about. If we are to find something in common, what is that? Because I'm Asian, you're Western, I'm male, you're female. All these different agendas, but the commonality is that we are all being. We are all part of that web, but where that web meets is where Anatta meets, right? It is that we are all arising out of the non-phenomenal, which is, I guess, tough. You can't. I don't know. I haven't seen. I think there is more of that happening these days. That there's more like people who have gone deeply enough into their own consciousness and spend enough time with meditation and self-inquiry to see that, to at least have a glimpse that I is an illusion. You see, but just getting to that point in groups. I dream of corporations that who of organizations who are made of people who share this understanding without drugs. Because obviously there are a lot of, I take a look at some of the festival culture that goes on here with Burning Man and all these festivals, and there actually is they talk about dropping in, right? Like drop into a kind of collective field. I mean, this obviously now gets into Rupert Sheldrake and morphic fields, but there are experiences like that are certainly happening and have a lot of relation to anatta, ego death, collective consciousnesses. But to do that in a stable way as part of a greater, I guess, in many ways, is an ethical framework, right? Because the Dharma is kind of like almost like a self-contained vehicle for acting and behaving and evolving. That takes a certain teaching. It takes a vehicle of precepts and of instructions, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That
Now,
ethical context is very important, I think. And there's lots of controversy now about mindfulness. How much mindfulness can be or should be, divorced from those kinds of concerns. It's interesting that right now, though, there's also a lot of interest among some or many mindfulness teachers to incorporate social justice concerns, which I think is a very positive development. Anyway, you were starting to say something. Go ahead.
no, I've lost that train of thought now.
Well, I mean, I can go ahead in a number of ways.
Please do.
Well, um, yeah, one direction is this wonderful metaphor that I think is so important in Mahayana Buddhism, Indra's net. I'm sure you're familiar with that. The idea that the cosmos can be understood as a net, not a two-dimensional, but a three-dimensional net that extends infinitely in all directions. And at the I don't know, what do we say? The interstice, the core, the knot. At every knot, there's a jewel that is in fact reflecting all the other jewels. And so this way of understanding the cosmos is wonderful because it's not simply saying, we're all one. Because in a way, we're obviously not one. There's a difference between Ken and David, right? But nonetheless, we're connected. And the point of the Indra's net metaphor is that every jewel is affecting and is affected by all the other jewels. So we're constantly manifesting, bouncing off, influencing, being influenced by all the others. And yet, there's also space there for difference in the sense that the jewel that is Ken is nonetheless in certain ways different from the jewel that is David. And I think this is really important. Otherwise, people misunderstand non-duality. I mean, it's better to say not two and not one. Neither one of those concepts really captures, I think, what's being pointed at here.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, if someone were to come to you just fresh, wanting to learn about meditation and Buddhism, how would you guide them and point them?
Well, I mean, that does happen to me. It depends on what they're looking for, if they want to learn how to meditate, what to do physically and mentally, well, that's pretty straightforward. One can go through that pretty carefully within maybe an hour or so. Mm-hmm. But as we know, it's not something that can be exhausted in lifetimes. But so one can help start them off. In most cases, that situation doesn't arise because what I'm usually doing is responding to invitations. So I'll be invited to give a workshop or a workshop retreat, sometimes on Zen, but more often incorporating something to do with modernity, social engagement, and more recently, especially EcoDharma. So that's been the way that I've been sort of running around here and there, responding to those invitations. One interesting thing that's happening now, and just in the last year, is that along with some friends, I'm helping to found the Rocky Mountain EcoDharma Retreat Center here in Boulder County, not much more than half an hour from North Boulder. 160 acres or 180 acres, pristine, where we'll be able to do a lot of different things there. It'll be open to a variety of teachers and groups, but we really want to focus on this question of ecological engagement. There's one other EcoDharma center in the world that I know of. It's in the Spanish Pyrenees. I had an opportunity to visit and co-lead a retreat there last year. But this is really where I think the what is it? Rubber hits the road. Is that the metaphor? In the sense that how do we really start to bring the Buddhist teachings and practices to make them really engage with the kind of ecological challenges we face today? Not just ecological, of course. It's interesting how, if you think of Standing Rock, how social justice issues are now clearly entwined as well, given the roles
Absolutely.
like Native Americans as water protectors and so forth.
Absolutely.
But
And feminist issues too.
feminist issues for sure. And the EcoDharma is a new concept. It involves a number of things. It's really not fully defined, but as I understand it, it includes, uh, for me, meditation in nature. It's interesting. The Buddha was born between trees, right? Lumbini Grove, when his mother went into early labor. He left home, went into the forest, studied with teachers, ascetic practices in the forest, meditated, awakened under the Bodhi tree, taught under trees, lived under trees, died between two trees. But we tend to do almost all of our practice, for many people, all of their practice, in four-cornered rooms.
Mm.
Are we missing something? Is there some dimension there? I mean, meditation in nature can be very powerful in unexpected ways. It can kind of open us up in a way that the four walls don't necessarily help. That's one
Yes.
side of it. Another aspect is what we've been talking a little bit about, is really exploring and reflecting together on the implications of Buddhist teachings for how we understand and respond to the ecological crisis. And also turning that around, asking, okay, what does the ecological crisis imply about how we've been understanding and practicing Buddhism? Because I think there's some reciprocal issues there that we need to look at. I think the ecological crisis in particular really requires us to clarify what is really liberating about the Buddhist path in our day and age, um, which means, somewhat new vocabularies, new ways of talking, maybe some different ways of practicing. Because, Buddhism is traditionally a pre-modern set of traditions that are culturally conditioned in certain ways that don't always apply today, right? We're in a different kind of culture, we're in a different situation. How do we distinguish between what's essential and what's culturally and historically conditioned that maybe we can let go or should let go of, right? So that's a huge challenge. And then thirdly, EcoDharma to me means not just talking about these things, reflecting on them together, but also activism. How do we actually bring this so that we actually are engaging rather than just sitting on our bottoms and thinking about these issues? And I think all of those are really important. And so I'm very excited that we have this new center. It's very complicated, all going very well, except despite the fact that it's not very expensive, we're still struggling to raise the money here and find some sponsors who would really, want to be a part of it. That's been the big challenge. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think that this is one of the really important directions, not only for Buddhism, but for other related non-dualist spiritual traditions, is, how do we bring these traditions in relationship with the kind of situation that we're in today? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm on board. I think such a crucial part to to of uh, of solving the ecological crisis is awakening love of nature, and
Hmm.
there is so much complexity and aliveness in the natural world, so much diversity, so much
Hmm.
wisdom, that often is untapped,
Hmm.
unlocked. Sort of, as you said, actually, I'm a big fan of James Hillman.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and James Hillman talked about how our consciousness is shaped by our environment, right?
Yep.
The buildings we live in, the architecture of a city, and
Right. Yep.
there are so many deep and subtle layers again that that are transformed when say you've had a childhood in nature versus a childhood in a big city where everything is right angles, concrete.
Mm.
Very very important psycho. Again, I use the word psycho spiritual layers are formed in that formative period, and
Without knowing what's happening. You're right. Yeah, largely preconscious.
absolutely, it's so unconscious, and
Yeah.
the the range the range of emotions and experience that you can have in nature it is I think largely unseen
Mm.
by most people, and awakening that
Mm.
is I think a big part of it. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's important not to romanticize it. I mean,
sure.
that's not what it means. I mean, sometimes it's scary, sometimes it's a bit dangerous, sometimes it's uncomfortable. Too hot, too cold, wet, mosquitoes, etc., etc. So, but that's part of that's part of the process. That's part of dealing with our dukkha. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great point. I almost see sometimes nature as a mirror of the human condition. It can show you, yeah, the
Yeah.
worst and best parts of it.
Mm.
David, thank you so much. We've obviously covered so much ground here. We could go on for longer, but I think just launching us off and just having material for people to
Mm.
think about, and you've written so many books. People can look you up. Certainly put a link to your website.
Thank you.
Uh,
I appreciate that. Davidloy.org, very simple. Yeah,
Absolutely,
that's right.
and wish you the very best in
Thank
your
you.
eco-dharmic endeavors at
Thank
some
you for
point.
this invitation, Ken.
Absolutely, David.
Excuse me.
Yes,
I
yes,
enjoyed getting to know you, and we can hope that this recording will be of interest and benefit to some people. And
absolutely.
in the meantime, keep up the good work.
Thank you, David.
Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye.